if it were not for a sensational best-selling book and a subsequent motion picture called The Amityville Horror, along with several sequels, The Village of Amityville, Long Island, and the story of the slaughter that occurred at the DeFeo house, would hardly evoke any public interest. As it is, Amityville has become identified with what was marketed as an outstanding true horror story, but which, in the final analysis, is only a well-publicized, run-of-the-mill, haunted house story, with overtones of mass murder. Did the evil spirit of a dead Indian chief haunt the house? Was the property built on the site of an ancient Indian burial ground? Did green slime ooze from the walls and blood pour from taps? Is Ronald DeFeo Jr. the son of Satan? Because of the horrific events that took place in Amityville during the night of the 13th of November 1974, one thing is certain: Amityville will never be the same again. So I set out on an equally terrifying journey to find out why. My journey started in the sleepy Long Island village of Amityville, then to call upon several of the drug-crazed friends of Ronnie DeFeo. I met with a bunch of crooked and brutal cops, a biased whip-'em and hang-'em judge, and I examined vital evidence that the police had lost, then mysteriously found. Finally, I met the monster they call the Amityville Horror behind the grim walls of his prison in upstate New York. This is the true story of the Amityville Horror, and you can believe every word. Ronald Joseph DeFeo Jr. was born on the 26th of September 1951 at the Adelphi Hospital in Brooklyn, New York. He was the first of 5 children, and his father, Ronald Sr., then a textile worker, was 20 years old. His mother, Louise, was still a teenager, a short and porky child. Ronald Jr.'s classmates nicknamed him Butch, a sobriquet that has stayed with him until the present day. He was a sullen, troublesome, and lazy pupil who caused trouble not only to his teachers, but also to other students with whom he was always fighting. He was always coming home bruised black and blue, and on one occasion he suffered a superficial stab wound in the back when another lad attacked him with a knife. In the early 70s, Ronald Sr. started working for his father-in-law and appears to have been well paid for his labors. Deciding that their Brooklyn apartment was now too small, and with Louise expecting her 5th child, they moved out to the more affluent surroundings of Long Island, and after a little house hunting, they chose the sleepy waterside village of Amityville. The name Amityville suggests peace and contentment, and at the very least, friendship. The township is home to around 11,000 residents, many of whom commute daily to New York, 35 miles to the west. Amityville straddles the Great South Bay on Long Island and is a popular boating center because its proximity to ocean beaches attracts a large influx of summer residents. Local history began in the 1650s when settlers from Connecticut and eastern Long Island first came to what is now called Huntington. Before that, King Henry VII of England and his successors claimed tithe to the area by right of discovery, resulting from John Cabot's voyage of discovery in 1496. Until the DeFeo massacre, said one resident, about the only crimes were when vandals ripped small boats from their moorings in the bay nearby. On the 28th of July, 1965, Ronald DeFeo Sr. attained a trophy-sized piece of the American dream when he purchased a 2.5-story Dutch colonial-style house from Joseph and Mary Riley. Paying an unknown amount, he acquired the splendid clapboard property at number 112 Ocean Avenue, with a swimming pool and private dock backing into a protected canal. Initially, the family was overwhelmed with the house and its amenities, but they soon began to find their feet in their new surroundings and grew accustomed to life in suburbia. But not everyone in Amityville was happy that the loud and flashy DeFeos had chosen to live in their quiet community, and gossip was rife that the family had links with organized crime. Symbolizing his family's new life, Mr. DeFeo placed a sign in their front yard that read "High, High Hopes." To distinguish themselves even further, he commissioned an artist to create life-size portraits of the family, which eventually hung on the walls of the staircase. In one, father and son, Ronald Sr. and Butch, sit side by side, smiling at the artist, while father pours a glass of wine for his son. In another, the two daughters pose on a love seat, half smiles on their faces. In a third painting, the two young brothers pose with Mark's arm on John's shoulder. Appropriately perhaps for such a paternalistic family, there was no portrait of the mother, Louise. The interior of the house was made even more explicit, with its expensive furnishings, crystal chandelier, and alabaster fireplace. All of this gave solid substance to the DeFeo's middle-class family life. But if the facade the family presented to the outside world was a tasteful expression of middle-class family values, the actual relationships within the family were quite the opposite. Ronald DeFeo Sr. was the son of Rocco and Antoinette DeFeo. According to those who knew him, Ronald was a physically imposing man who ruled his family with an iron fist and demanded respect. He would change from a civil person into a savage animal at the slightest infraction, and everyone in the household knew that nothing could stop the man when he lost his temper. Louise DeFeo was the youngest daughter of Michael and Angela Brigante. She was a gentle person and loyal to her husband. He did not share these warm feelings, believing that his wife was enjoying a string of affairs, including a dalliance with the painter who had produced the family portraits. Although there was no evidence of adultery, mere suspicion seemed to merit beatings, and she experienced these on a regular experience basis. Beneath the veneer of success and happiness, then, Ronald DeFeo Sr. was a hot-tempered man, given to bouts of rage and violence. There were stormy fights between him and Louise, and he loomed before his children as a demanding authority figure. As the eldest child, young Ronald bore the brunt of his father's temper and attempts to impose discipline. Bullied at school, his father encouraged him to stick up for himself. While this advice pertained to school problems, it did not apply to the way Ronald was being treated at home. DeFeo had no tolerance for backtalk and disobedience, keeping his eldest son on a short leash and refusing to let him stand up for himself in the way he was commanded to at school. After moving to Long Island, Ronald's first school was the junior high in Riverhead. As he matured into adolescence, he gained in size and became less of a sitting duck for his father's abuse. There were frequent shouting episodes which often degenerated into boxing matches, as father and son came to blows with little provocation. While DeFeo Sr. was not highly skilled in the art of interpersonal relations, he was astute enough to realize that his son's bouts of temper and violence were highly irregular and of a different kind to his own. After Butch seriously beat up his sister Dawn, he and his wife arranged for him to visit a psychiatrist. This was to no avail because Butch simply employed a passive-aggressive stance with his therapist and rejected any notion that he needed help. In the absence of any solution, his parents employed a time-honored strategy for placating unruly children by buying Butch anything he wanted and giving him money. His father presented his 14-year-old son with a $14,000 speedboat to cruise the Amityville River. Whenever Butch wanted money, all he had to do was ask, and if he wasn't in the mood to ask, he just took what was lying around. When this strategy failed, Butch was packed off to St. Francis Prep in Brooklyn, where he was thrown out at the end of his 9th grade. Finally, he attended the Amityville High School and, at the age of 17, left the school system for good. On the same day, his father bought him a car. By this time, he had begun using drugs, such as heroin and LSD, and had also started dabbling in schemes involving petty theft. His behavior was becoming increasingly psychotic as well, and not confined to outbursts within his home. One afternoon, while out on a hunting trip with a few friends, he pointed a loaded rifle at one member of the party, a young man he had known for years. He watched with a stony expression as the young man's face turned white before his fear made him take flight. At this point, Butch calmly lowered his gun, and when they caught up with each other later that afternoon, Butch asked, sneeringly, why his friend had left so soon. At the age of 18, Butch was given a job at his father's car dealership, which was a sole agency for Buick. By his own account, it was an easy job, where little was expected of him. Regardless of whether he showed up for work or not, he received a cash allowance from his father at the end of each week, which sometimes amounted to $500. This he used to run his car and buy alcohol and drugs. In January 1971, Butch DeFeo met a young woman called Geraldine in the 9th Bar in New York City. They dated for quite a while. Then, in December 1973, she found out that she was pregnant. His father started hounding the couple to get married, and after their daughter Stephanie was born, they married on the 17th of October 1974 at the Garfield Grant Hotel in Long Branch, New Jersey. Altercations with his father were growing ever more frequent and progressively more violent. One evening, a fight broke out between Butch's father and mother. In order to settle the matter, Butch grabbed a 12-gauge shotgun from his room, loaded a shell into the chamber, and charged downstairs to the scene of the fight. Without hesitation or calling out to the participants to break up the argument, Butch pointed the barrel at his father's face, yelling, "Leave that woman alone, I'm going to kill you, you fat fuck, this is it." He pulled the trigger, but the gun mysteriously did not discharge. Ronald Sr. froze where he stood and watched in grim amazement as his own son lowered the weapon and simply walked out of the room with casual indifference to the fact that he had almost killed his own father. While that particular fight was over, Butch's actions foreshadowed the violence he would soon unleash, not only upon his father, but also his entire family. This incident with the shotgun seems to have inspired in Ronald Sr. something akin to a religious conversion. He became a devout Catholic and built several religious shrines amid the manicured grounds of High Hopes, and neighbors often saw him saying his rosary in front of a shrine of St. Joseph and the Christ child that he had built on his front lawn. In the weeks before the Amityville slayings, relations between Butch DeFeo and his father reached breaking point. Apparently dissatisfied with the money he earned working for his father, Butch devised a scheme to defraud his family further. 2 weeks before the massacre, he was sent on an errand by one of the staff at the Buick dealership, charged with the responsibility of depositing $1,800 in cash and $20,000 in checks at the bank. Accompanied by a fellow worker from the dealership, they departed for the bank at 12:30 p.m. They were gone for 2 hours. When they finally returned, it was to report that they had been robbed at gunpoint while waiting at a red light. Ronald Sr. exploded with rage, berating the staff member who had sent his son in the first place. The police were called and naturally asked to speak to Butch. In reality, he and his accomplice had kept the money and split it 2 ways. Instead of engaging in at least a pretense of cooperation, he concocted a description of the fictional robber, becoming tense and irritable with detectives. As the officers began to suspect that he was lying and focused their questions on the 2 hours he was away, his behavior became aggressive. "Wouldn't you have rushed back to the dealership once you had been robbed of so much money?" asked the police. "Where had you been during that time?" In response to their questions, Butch began to curse at them, banging on the hood of a car to emphasize his rage. The police backed off for a moment, but his father had already come to the conclusion that his son was lying and had stolen the money himself. On the Friday prior to the murders at High Hopes, Butch had been asked by the police to examine some mugshots in the possibility that he might be able to recognize the robber. Initially he agreed, but pulled out at the last moment. When Ronald DeFeo Jr. heard of this, he cornered his son at work, demanding to know why he wouldn't cooperate with the police. "You've got the devil on your back," his father screamed at him. This time, Butch did not hesitate. "You fat prick," he screamed, "I'll kill you." Then he ran to his car and sped off. While this incident had not resulted in an exchange of blows, a final confrontation was clearly imminent. The still shroud of night blanketed the village of Amityville in the early hours of Wednesday, November 14th, 1974. Stray house pets and the occasional passing car were the only signs of life as families and neighbors slumbered. But hatred and savagery were brewing beneath the seeming calm at High Hopes on Ocean Avenue. The entire DeFeo family had retired to bed, with the exception of Butch. He sat in the quiet of his room, brooding on what he wanted to do, which was to ensure that his father and family would trouble him no more. Butch was the only member of the family with his own room. His violent disposition and the fact that he was the eldest had afforded him this small luxury. It also provided him with a private storage place for a number of weapons he collected and sometimes sold. On this particular night, he withdrew a .35 caliber Marlin Martini action rifle from his closet. He set off, stealthily but resolutely, towards the door of his parents' master bedroom. Quietly pushing the door open, he stood, momentarily observing them as they slept, totally oblivious to the horror that was about to engulf them. Then, without hesitation, Butch raised the rifle to his shoulder and pulled the trigger. The first of 8 fatal shots fired that night slammed into his father's back. Just after 3:00 a.m., Butch DeFeo completed the annihilation of his family. Each defenseless member had been brutally slain in cold blood. The family dog, Shaggy, tied up outside the boathouse, was barking furiously in reaction to the sporadic bursts of violence emanating from the house. The animal's barking did not distract Butch in the least. Aware that he had completed the task he had set out to do, he now turned his attention to cleaning himself up and establishing an alibi to throw off the inevitable police investigation that would ensue. First, he showered and trimmed his beard. Then, dressed in jeans and leather work boots, he collected up his bloodied clothing, the rifle with its scabbard, and retrieved one of the expended cartridge cases from the floor. Stuffing everything into a pillowcase, he drove off into the pre-dawn light. His first stop was at the end of Ocean Avenue, where he threw the rifle into the dock. From there, he drove to Brooklyn and disposed of the pillowcase and its contents by throwing them into a sewer. Then he reported for work at his late father's dealership, as if nothing had happened. For him, it was 6 a.m. and business as usual. Butch did not remain at work for long. He called home several times, and when his father failed to show up, he acted as though he were bored with nothing to do and left around noon. He called his girlfriend, Mindy Weiss, to let her know that he would be at her place early from work and that he wanted to stop by and see her. On his way, he passed a friend, Robert Kelsky, and recalled the incident later during a prison interview. "In my drugged stupor, I was driving down the road in Amityville, and Robert Kelsky, a junkie strung out on heroin, pulled up alongside of my car and started asking off-the-wall questions. This didn't register then because Kelsky was a junkie and a thief who had previously burglarized both of my neighbors' homes, so I paid his questions no mind." DeFeo reached his girlfriend's house at around 1:30 p.m. Mindy was 19 years old, an attractive and popular waitress at Longfellow's bar. He casually mentioned on arrival that he had tried to call home several times, and although there were cars in the driveway, there was no response. To make the point, he called his home from Mindy's apartment with the same predictable result. Acting as though he was puzzled but unconcerned, Butch took Mindy shopping during the afternoon. From the mall in Massapequa, they drove to see Patricia and Robert Geiger, where DeFeo bought 5 $10 bags of heroin and shot them up. He said, "I was out of it and actually forgot about what had happened at my house. I sort of blacked out." Just after 6:00 p.m., Butch arrived at Henry's Bar in Amityville, where he met Robert Kelsky. Once again, he feigned concern over his inability to reach anyone at home. "I'm going to have to go home and break a window to get in," he said. "Well, do what you have to do," his friend replied blithely. Ronald left the bar on his supposed journey of discovery, only to return within minutes in a state of agitation and dismay. "Bob, you gotta help me," he implored. "Someone shot my mother and father." The two friends were joined by a small group of patrons, and they all piled into Butch's car, driving off with Kelsky at the wheel. Approximately 15 hours had elapsed since the murders were committed. Within moments of arriving at the house, Kelsky had entered the front door and raced upstairs into the master bedroom. He retraced his steps to find Butch distraught with grief and dismay. Joe Yeswit found a telephone in the kitchen and called the police. At precisely 6:40 p.m. on the 13th of November, 1974, Patrolman Kenneth J. Grigulski of the Amityville Village Police Department, based at Green Lane, received a call from his control room to attend 112 Ocean Avenue, where there had been a report of a shooting. As he drove up to the house, he saw a group of young men standing in the driveway, and one of them tearfully introduced himself as Ronald DeFeo. He said, "My mother and father are dead. I went into the house and climbed the stairs," said the officer. "In the master bedroom, I found a white male lying on his stomach, and he had been shot dead. Next to him was a white female in the same position, and she had been shot to death. I proceeded to a second bedroom where I discovered 2 young boys in separate beds. They were lying on their stomachs, and they had been shot dead. I came downstairs and used the dining room telephone to call my headquarters and informed them that there were 4 bodies in the house, and they should notify the first squad detectives." Continuing his account, the policeman added, "Almost immediately, Ronald DeFeo told me that he had 2 sisters. Evidently, he had heard me talking over the telephone, and with that, I ran back upstairs and checked a bedroom door that had been closed. I found a young girl's body there. She was lying, like the others, spread-eagled on her stomach. She was shot dead, too. And I seen a staircase that I thought led to an attic, which actually led to another bedroom upstairs on the 3rd floor, and I found another female body there. I immediately came back downstairs, recalled my headquarters, and advised them I had 2 more bodies. After that call, I went into the kitchen. I stood there with Ronald DeFeo and his friend Robert Kelsky, and I put my hand on his shoulder and just told him to take it easy. I stood there and waited until Detective Sergeant Camaroto and Lieutenant Edward Lowe turned up. They just checked the scene and they came back downstairs too, and it was shortly thereafter that the homicide detectives arrived. It was a scene that I'll never forget, and it haunts me to this day. At the autopsy, the medical examiner, Dr. Howard Alderman, determined that Ronald DeFeo Sr., aged 43, had been shot twice in the lower back. The bullets went through the kidney and spine. One stopped in the neck and the other plowed through the body and onto the mattress. Death was most likely instantaneous since he had stayed on the mattress and did not crawl out of bed. Louise DeFeo, aged 42, had been shot twice. The gunfire that had killed her husband seems to have awakened Butch's mother, and she was turning in her bed towards the doorway. The first bullet entered her back, exited through her chest, re-entered her left breast and wrist before landing in the mattress. The second bullet destroyed her right lung, diaphragm, and liver. Death most likely occurred in a matter of seconds, since she never put up a struggle. Mark DeFeo, aged 12, and John DeFeo, aged 7, had been shot once. From the evidence, the medical examiner determined that their killer stood less than 2 feet from the boys when he discharged the gun. Bullets penetrated the heart, lungs, diaphragm, and liver of each victim. In addition, John's spinal cord was severed, causing involuntary movements of his lower body. Allison DeFeo, aged 13, had been shot once. Like her mother, she had awakened and turned her head towards the doorway. The bullet smashed upward from her left cheek to her right ear, entering the brain and skull. The bullet exited, hitting the wall, and bounced on the floor where it came to rest. Death was instantaneous, and powder burns on Allison's eyes indicated that she was awake at the time of her murder and staring down the barrel of a gun. Dawn DeFeo, aged 18, had been shot once. Her killer had stood less than 3 feet away and fired at the back of her neck. The bullet entered the left ear and collapsed the left side of her face. Brain particles soaked the pillow, and the sheets were covered with menstrual blood. In Dr. Alderman's opinion, it appeared from the evidence that this was a gangland-style execution, and that at least 3 or 4 people had been involved with the control of the victims and their murders. From the outset, Ronald DeFeo was known to have a police record. He was a drug user currently on probation for stealing an outboard motor. He was first interviewed at the scene of the shootings at 6:55 p.m. by Detective Gaspar Randazzo, who had been working with the first squad detectives for 8 years. Randazzo asked the sole survivor to account for his movements that day. DeFeo replied, "I went to work, and upon coming home I found the door locked. I figured there might have been something wrong because the doors were locked, and I saw my parents' cars outside the house. I went back to the bar and spoke to Robert Kelski. I went back to the house, forced a window, and found the bodies of my family. I was scared, so I ran out and drove back to the bar for help. Then we all drove back and Joe called the police." Shortly after the interview began, Reverend McNamara arrived to administer last rites to the victims. At 7:15 p.m., Detectives Gozoloff, Napolitano, Sherville, Greco, Harrison, Reichert, and Detective Sergeant Barilski, all of the 1st Homicide Squad, arrived on the scene. They obtained permission to use the house next door, home to the Ireland family, as a command post. DeFeo was asked to leave the scene, and he was escorted next door where Detective Gozoloff spoke to him. Asked who might have shot his family, Butch told the detective that a man named Louis Fellini had a grudge against his folks. He was a mafia hitman, and he could be the murderer. "I had an argument with Fellini," he said. "I called him a cocksucker, and that caused problems between him and my father." DeFeo pledged his full cooperation and agreed to go to the 1st Precinct, calling beforehand at the Amityville police station to complete the paperwork that relieved the Amityville police of jurisdiction over the murders. On arrival at the 1st Precinct, Detective Gozoloff interviewed DeFeo in more depth. Butch explained that he worked for his father, who was the service manager of Carl Briganti Buick in Brooklyn, and that his grandfather, Mike Briganti, was the owner. He described the layout of his home in some detail. That night he said that he was up late watching a film called Castle Keep. He fell asleep watching the television around 2:00 a.m., and awoke at 4 a.m. with stomach pains. He remembered walking past the upstairs bathroom and noticed that his brother's wheelchair was in front of the door. Mark could only walk on crutches following an injury playing football, Butch explained. He also claimed to have heard the toilet flush. Since he couldn't get back to sleep, he decided to go to work early and went on to describe what he had been doing until the time he discovered the bodies. After Butch submitted his signed statement, the detectives continued to question him about his family and the suggestion that Fellini might be the killer. Butch replied that Fellini had lived with them for a period of time, during which he had helped Butch and his father carve out a hiding place in the basement, where Ronald Sr. kept a stash of gems and cash. His argument with Fellini had stemmed from an incident during which Fellini criticized some work Butch had done at the auto dealership. Butch also voluntarily confessed to being a casual user of heroin and admitted that he had set one of his father's boats on fire so that an insurance claim could be made rather than paying for the motor, which Butch had originally blown up. The detectives finished their questioning at around 3 a.m., and Butch went to sleep on a cot in a filing room at the back of the police station. DeFeo had given every appearance of a cooperative witness, and so far the detectives had no reason to hold him under suspicion of murder. The circumstances began to change, though, as investigators intensified their examination of physical evidence, both at the crime scene and in the police laboratory. A crucial discovery was made at around 2:30 a.m. on the 15th of November, when Detective John Shervill conducted a last sweep through the DeFeo bedrooms. The rooms where the murders had taken place had been scoured thoroughly, while Ronald's room had, up to that point, been given only a cursory once-over. But on closer scrutiny, Detective Shervill spotted a pair of empty rectangular boxes, each with labels describing their contents as .22 and .35 Marlin rifles. Shervill was unaware that a .35 caliber Marlin had been the murder weapon, but he took the boxes anyway in the event that they may become important evidence. Indeed they were. Shortly after returning to the police headquarters with the boxes, he learned exactly what make of weapon had been used in the shootings, because a firearms examiner had identified the caliber of the murder weapon. Detective Sergeant Della Penna had wasted no time in examining the spent shell casings and the bullets used to kill the DeFeo family. He had determined that powder residue found at the scene was partially burnt particles of nitrocellulose gunpowder. The spent lead-jacketed bullets were of .35 caliber Remington Arms manufacture and were originally components of Western Co. .35 caliber cartridge cases. Detectives leading the murder investigation now began to consider the possibility that Butch had been lying to them, and indeed that he may be their prime suspect, knowing far more about the killings than he had so far told them. At 8:45 a.m., Detectives George Harrison and Napolitano shook DeFeo awake. "Did you find Fellini yet?" was his first question, as he quickly found out the officers were not there to answer Butch's questions, but to read him his rights. Butch protested that he had been trying to cooperate all along, and that it wasn't necessary to read him his rights. He went so far as to waive his right to counsel, all to prove that he was an innocent witness with nothing to hide. By this time, Gozaloff and Napolitano were due to go off duty, and two other officers, Lieutenant Robert Dunn and Detective Dennis Rafferty, took over. They meant business, and in the years following the Amityville shootings, both would be heavily criticized by a New York Commission of Investigation for using illegal practices to gain verbal confessions from suspects. Rafferty began by reading DeFeo his rights and proceeded to question him about his activities and whereabouts over the prior 2 days. Suddenly, Rafferty zeroed in on the time of the murders. Butch had written in his statement that he was up as early as 4:00 a.m., and that he heard his brother in the bathroom at that time. "Butch, the whole family was found lying dead in their bedclothes," said Rafferty. "That indicates to me that it didn't happen at like 1 o'clock in the afternoon after you had gone to work." Rafferty continued to press until he was able to pry Butch away from his earlier account of when the crime took place, establishing that the murders actually occurred between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. With this slight fissure, DeFeo's crudely constructed story began to crumble. Dunn and Rafferty hammered at the discrepancies between Butch's stated version of the events and what the crime scene evidence indicated had actually happened. Once the time of the murder was established, Butch was implicated by his own statement, which confirmed his presence in the house at the crucial time. His response to this predicament was a desperate attempt to lead the detectives up the garden path, but they were not accepting the bait. "Butch, it's incredible," said Rafferty. "It's almost unbelievable. You know we have a .35 caliber gun box from your room. Every one of the victims has been shot with a .35 caliber, and you've seen the whole thing. There has to be more to it. It's your gun that was used, so where's the fucking gun?" he shouted just inches from Butch's face. His desperation growing by the minute, DeFeo continued to lie, even though his lies sucked him in more squarely to the commission of the murders. He told his interrogators that at 3:30 a.m., Louis Fellini woke him up and put a revolver to his head. Another man was present in the room, he said, but upon further questioning, he could not provide any kind of physical description to help the police. According to his new version of events, Fellini and his companion led Butch from room to room, murdering each one of his family members. The police allowed DeFeo plenty of rope, and as he continued talking, he eventually implicated himself with his account of how he gathered up and removed the evidence from the scene. "Wait a minute," said Rafferty. "Why did you pick up the cartridge if you had nothing to do with it? You didn't know it was your gun that was used." Perhaps sensing that his position was deteriorating rapidly, Butch did not immediately respond to the question. The detectives played a waiting game and allowed him to keep talking. They had already obtained a good deal of evidence implicating DeFeo, particularly the absurd pretense that Fellini and his accomplice had taken him along on their killing spree while sparing his life alone. Once they had been given a solid description of how, according to Butch, the murders had taken place, Dunn went in for the kill. "They must have made you a piece of it," he said. "They must have made you shoot at least one of them or some of them." Butch tripped on the snare and the trap was sprung. "It didn't happen that way, did it?" asked Rafferty. "Give me a minute," DeFeo replied, putting his head in his hands. "Butch, they never were there, were they? Fellini and the other guy were never there." At last came the confession. "No," said Butch. "It all started so fast. Once I started, I just couldn't stop. It went so fast." On Wednesday, November 19th, 1975, a year and 5 days after the murders, the presiding judge instructed the jury in the deliberation chamber to return to the court with a verdict. On Friday, November 21st, 1975, Ronald DeFeo Jr. was found guilty of 6 counts of second-degree murder. 2 weeks later, he was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison on all 6 counts. He became eligible for parole in 1999 and insists that he is an innocent man. Around the time of the Amityville murders, Suffolk County, covering the eastern portion of Long Island, beginning approximately 45 miles east of Manhattan and adjacent to suburban Nassau County, had a population of well over 666,500. It has one of the largest police departments in New York State after the New York City Police Department, the New York State Police, and the Nassau County Police. Suffolk also ranks as one of the highest-paid police departments in the country. This police force also has something else to be proud of, for it enjoys the highest confession and oral admission clear-up rate of probably anywhere in the world. In April 1989, a State of New York Commission of Investigation published its report on an investigation into the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office and Police Department. In various sub-reports, the Commission unearthed a number of serious problems, which included misconduct and deficiencies in homicide investigations and prosecutions, misconduct and deficiencies in narcotics investigations and prosecutions, illegal wiretaps, failure by the District Attorney's Office to investigate and punish misconduct by agency employees and law enforcement personnel, deficiencies in the oversight of police personnel, and a whole host of other issues including corruption, the unlawful gaining of confessions by overzealous police officers, police brutality and precinct jumping, and unlawful police practice used to stonewall lawyers trying to gain access to their clients. As a result of the Commission's damning findings, one senior police officer committed suicide and dozens of other ranks retired. From 7 to the 11th of December 1986, Newsday published a lengthy 5-part series on deficiencies and misconduct in Suffolk County homicide prosecutions, stretching back to the early 70s. The series included a statement that 94% of Suffolk homicide prosecutions involved confessions or verbal admissions. This figure was confirmed to the Commission by the former commanding officer of Suffolk County Homicide, none other than Detective Lieutenant Robert Dunn, one of the 2 detectives who had obtained a confession from Ronald DeFeo. This was an astonishingly high figure compared to other jurisdictions, so high, in fact, that it provoked skepticism regarding the police agency's use of confessions. For example, in Newsday's study, which compared 361 Suffolk homicide defendants from 1975 to 1985 to 700 cases from 6 other large suburban counties, Suffolk's 94% confession rate far exceeded the 55% to 73% rate in the 6 other jurisdictions. The national average was 48%. There is no doubt that DeFeo had been precinct jumped, as 2 attorneys, Richard Weisling and Richard Hartman, who had tried to see him, were given a thorough runaround by the Suffolk County Police. Ronald DeFeo also says that his confession was beaten out of him by Detective Lieutenant Robert Dunn and Detective Dennis Rafferty, who hit him with a telephone book. To verify this claim, it is only necessary to go back to the first day when DeFeo appeared before District Judge Signorelli. The judge was so shocked at the defendant's appearance that he ordered a medical examination. The next day, a doctor reported that he had found black and blue bruises over different parts of the defendant's body and legs, a cut lip, and a great deal of swelling on his face. These injuries were not present when DeFeo was taken into police custody. During an interview for this book, which took place at the Yafank Police Headquarters on the 27th of September 1994, a smiling Dennis Rafferty said, "Sure, of course we did a good job on him. What do you expect?" Ronald DeFeo Jr. was not the only one to receive a good beating from the police. Robert Kelsky, Chuck Twesbury, and Barry Springer also say that they were seriously assaulted and ordered to sign confessions for murder. Patricia and Robert Geiger were even accused of murder. On the 16th of November 1974, DeFeo received a visit from a Reverend McNamara, the priest who had given the dead family their last rites. Within hours of McNamara's departure, jail records show that Butch's uncle, Vincent Procita, paid Butch a visit. Rocco DeFeo, Butch's grandfather, and his brother Peter, both members of the organized crime circuit, had asked Procita to get Ronald to sign a document, making Rocco administrator of his late father's estate. Butch was told that if he refused, he would be killed in prison. He deferred to his relatives and signed. The following day, DeFeo received a visit from the FBI and was questioned for 2 hours about the DeFeo and Briganti families' links with the mafia. Agent Robert Sweeney explained that his own daughter had been acquainted with Don DeFeo. He went on to say that the FBI had placed a legal wiretap on Michael Briganti's telephone. One of the conversations they recorded was between Briganti and Peter DeFeo, who said that Butch knew too much and they were going to have him killed. Sweeney offered Butch the witness protection program if he told them what he knew. He refused. Jail records show that on the 19th of November, DeFeo received a visit from two more attorneys. Alexander Hesterberg and Jacob Siegfried told him that Michael Briganti wanted him to sign another document, this time making him the administrator for the late Mrs. DeFeo's estate. Butch told them about the visit from the FBI, and Jacob Siegfried said, "That's all the more reason to sign then." He was also told that his aunt, Phyllis Procita, was working for the district attorney's office, which she was, and unless he agreed to allow Siegfried to represent him with an insanity defense, he wouldn't get out of prison alive. Realizing that his life was now in great peril, DeFeo agreed to both suggestions. At his second court appearance, Siegfried failed to turn up. When the judge asked DeFeo where his lawyer was, he told him about the prison visits, and the judge remarked, "Even Stevie Wonder could see through this." Events took an even more sinister turn a few weeks later when the judge appointed William E. Weber as DeFeo's defense attorney. Weber, who had never represented anyone in a murder case before, was also running as the judge's campaign manager in the forthcoming surrogate court elections. Weber collected a fat retainer from the DeFeo and Briganti families and moved on to prepare an insanity defense. Indeed, he started off with honorable intentions by employing the services of Herman Race, acknowledged as one of the most experienced investigators on Long Island. He had been a homicide detective for 20 years, and his first job was to examine the firearm and ballistic evidence on behalf of his client. He quickly discovered traces of backfire on Don DeFeo's nightdress, caused by unburned gunpowder blowing back onto her clothing. The only conclusion that can be drawn from this is that Don had fired the rifle at least once on that fateful night. Armed with this information, an excited William Weber was quick to inform DeFeo's relatives, who were not pleased. The next afternoon, while the attorney was pulling up outside his home, two police officers stopped him and asked questions about unpaid parking tickets. They searched his car, and in the glove compartment they found an unlicensed handgun and arrested him. Later, under the influence of the Briganti family, the police decided to drop the charge. Weber was left in no doubt that the matter of the nightgown should not be raised again. With Butch protesting that he was not insane, William Weber, nevertheless, was carrying out his instructions from his client's family, who were, as DeFeo said, calling the shots. Counsel retained the services of a psychiatrist, Dr. Daniel Swartz, for a fee of $8,000 and a professional opinion that was tantamount to saying that Ronald DeFeo Jr. was insane. Shortly before the trial started, the prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Gerald Sullivan, asked Judge Signorelli to remove himself from the case, which he did. In turn, and quite illegally, Sullivan picked Judge Thomas M. Stark, a tough, no-nonsense man whom the prosecution could rely on to bat for their side. Judge Stark later dismissed this matter with a wave of his hand. "In hindsight," he said, "this was quite wrong, but things were different back then." With a psychiatrist in their pocket, the defense team now started to trawl elsewhere for people who knew DeFeo and tried to coerce them to testify that they thought that Butch was insane. William Davidge was approached, and in a sworn affidavit before Esther B. Hopkins, notary public for the state of Florida, dated the 6th of October, 1988, he had this to say: "I was a defense witness at the request of attorney William Weber, defense counsel for DeFeo in Suffolk County, state of New York. Weber told me during consultations that DeFeo was guilty, but told me he would get DeFeo declared insane by fabricating a defense of insanity. Weber had me state facts to back up his defense. I was uncooperative with Weber over matters he stated to me about my personal friendship with DeFeo and his family that were not true. Weber startled me because he was an officer of the court and represented DeFeo. I wanted to help DeFeo by telling the truth. I was directed through Weber to describe Ronald DeFeo as insane by testifying to acts to support the defense of insanity. The acts described were purposely directed to me while testifying by Weber's cross-examination at the DeFeo trial in an attempt to place DeFeo in a mental hospital and exonerate DeFeo from all criminal acts alleged in the indictment and proceedings. Weber advised me and ordered me to testify at his will to support his insanity defense, and he refused to allow me to testify in any other manner other than directed by him. At the time of my testimony, I did not know that I was violating any laws, nor could I appreciate a violation of any laws being violated, as I was completely unaware. I can also say that my brother Frank Devage informed me that he and William Weber made a deal in a backroom discussion in 1975. If William Weber was reluctantly breaking almost every rule in the book, the district attorney had no compunction in breaking them all, having schemed at standing down one judge and illegally engineering the appointment of another more suitable judge to try the case. Gerald Sullivan now needed to find a motive for the defendant's crimes. He thought he had hit the jackpot when he learned that the DeFeos had a substantial hoard of valuable jewelry in the house, which was now missing from the secret recess in the basement. He reasoned, therefore, that the accused had stolen it, and when his father had discovered the theft, Butch killed him and the rest of the family as well. Unfortunately, from Sullivan's point of view, the jewelry had recently been placed in a safety deposit box at the European Savings Bank in Amityville. In a desperate and quite illegal move to save the day, Sullivan called on the services of none other than Detective Rafferty, who was told to visit a number of DeFeo's friends, including Lynn and Roger Nonowitz. After speaking to them over some quite spurious matter, the detective asked them to testify that the DeFeos had other jewelry and that Butch had stolen it. Not only did the Nonowitzes expose this in court, but they also signed sworn affidavits explaining that the prosecution had asked them to commit perjury. Judge Stark dealt with this serious issue with his usual air of casual indifference, and that was the end of it. There is no doubt that a confession had been beaten out of DeFeo by the Suffolk County Police, and it had done him no good trying to implicate the alleged hitman, Louis Fellini, who was able to provide a solid alibi for the time of the murders. There was also no doubt that Ronald DeFeo was in the house when the murders were committed. But with the absence of motive, what was his reason for killing his family? The answer is that he did not have one, whereas his sister Dawn had a very strong motive indeed. After considerable research, it has been possible to disentangle the web of lies spun by DeFeo surrounding the murders and arrive at something nearer the truth. During the evening before the murders, DeFeo had been visiting his estranged wife, Geraldine. At around 8:00 p.m., she received a telephone call from Mrs. DeFeo, who was in a distressed state and crying. She asked to speak to her son, who came to the telephone, and then informed everyone else present that there was trouble between Dawn and her father. "The fucking bitch," he said. She started again. Dawn was not the neatest person in the world and had often left food to spoil in her room, which subsequently attracted a plague of flies all over the house. Now aged 18, she was attending the Catherine Gibbs Secretarial School at her parents' request. She was in love with her boyfriend, William Devage, who was moving to Florida, and she wanted to join him. Her parents were strongly against this idea and, according to friends and relatives, she had started experimenting with drugs as an escape from her situation at home, and, when aroused, she, like her father and eldest brother, had a terrifying temper that knew no bounds. In his sworn affidavit before Theodore Urach, Notary Public for the state of New York, dated the 27th of July, 1990, William Davidge affirmed that he knew that Dawn wanted to follow him to Florida, that she was using drugs such as LSD and mescaline, and that she had a bad temper that got out of hand at times. Davidge also said that Dawn had a deep hatred for her parents and her eldest brother, whom she used for cash handouts. Immediately after receiving the telephone call from his mother DeFeo, and Geraldine's brother Richard Raimondo departed for High Hopes. When they arrived, Butch gave Dawn the keys to his car and told her to take a long drive until she cooled off. Apparently, she followed his advice. Under the influence of drink and drugs, Butch and Richard went down to the basement, leaving the door open so that they could hear what was going on upstairs. They turned the television down low and began to play pool. Time seemed to pass very quickly for the two men when, to their shock, they heard a loud roar. Rushing upstairs, they located the bodies of the DeFeos, with the exception of Dawn, whom they found in her third-floor bedroom, dressed in a nightgown and cradling the .35 caliber Marlin rifle. Butch made a grab for the gun, and in the struggle that followed, his sister was shot in the head. Butch and Richard disposed of the weapon and the other incriminating evidence in the manner later explained to the police. Geraldine DeFeo recalled that during the early morning of the murders, Butch had woken her up and had told her what had happened. He then left the house, and that was the last she saw of him until his trial. She also recalled that her brother had confirmed the story, saying, "I have got to leave and get away, otherwise I am going to get fitted up for something I didn't do." Richard, who now lives under an assumed name in Florida, has since got married and has a son. "I know what I saw," he told the author, "and what Ronnie says is the truth. Problem is that my wife knows nothing about this, and I don't trust the police." Geraldine DeFeo has since been threatened, pushed to the ground, arrested and released by the police for conspiracy in the Amityville slayings. The officer involved was Detective Dennis Rafferty. If DeFeo's claims of innocence were to stand up, it was vital that two forensic issues were resolved. First and foremost was the matter of DeFeo's clothing that was contaminated with a small trace of blood. Detective Rafferty claimed that this was Dawn's blood, an assumption he had arrived at solely because the suspect had said he picked up a blood-covered cartridge case and wiped it on his shirt and jeans. For his part, DeFeo says, "This was an outright lie by Rafferty. The blood on my clothes was mine from the several beatings given to me by the Suffolk County Police. DNA testing can easily prove this because they still have the clothing." For many years, DeFeo has argued that it was his sister who killed the family, and that he shot Dawn during the struggle when he tried to retrieve the weapon, so the second issue revolves around Dawn's nightgown and the traces it bore of unburned gunpowder, indicating that she must have fired the .35 caliber Marlin rifle at least once that fateful night. At the autopsy, it was proved that the single bullet that had killed her had been fired at a distance of about 3 feet. This discounts any possibility that Dawn had shot herself, which leaves only one outstanding question. Which member or members of the family did she shoot dead? In June 1992, DeFeo's request for a motion for discovery and re-examination of the nightdress was heard before Judge Stark, who said that if DeFeo could fund the tests, and if the clothing was still in existence, he would order further forensic examinations. Gerald L. Lotto, acting for DeFeo, had received $10,000 from his client's grandmother, Angela Briganti, for DNA and gunpowder analysis. This money was now in an escrow account and therefore satisfied the first part of the judge's ruling. Lotto's task was now to ascertain the whereabouts of Dawn's nightdress. In reply, Assistant District Attorney Karen Pedersen twice told the court, under the penalty of perjury, that the garments had been destroyed. Perhaps her deceit weighed heavily on her, for several days later, her colleague Barbara Rose wrote a letter to the judge that significantly watered down Pedersen's claim. Again, under penalty of perjury, Assistant DA Rose said the clothing is no longer in the possession of the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, nor the Suffolk County Police Department. On the 21st of August, 1991, an investigator working on another case had reason to visit the Suffolk County Police Property Evidence Bureau at Yafank. While rummaging around, and quite by accident, Dennis O'Doherty discovered 2 boxes marked DeFeo. They contained Dawn's nightdress, a bag of bullets, and DeFeo's clothing, comprising a pair of black and blue socks, construction boots, brown work uniform, pair of blue jeans, plaid shirt, 3 printed pillowcases, and 1 blood-stained pillowcase. Several days after this discovery, Karen Pedersen wrote to Judge Stark, apologizing and explaining the clothing was found due to the ongoing efforts of the DA's office and the police department, which was yet another distortion of the truth. With the funding for tests in place and the clothing rediscovered, Judge Stark was legally obliged to honor his ruling, except that he chose not to. The evidence in question is still in existence today, and when interviewed during the research for this book, Dennis Rafferty said, "Not a chance in hell. This stuff, the clothing, will never be looked at again. We'll make sure of that." In reality, Ronald DeFeo Jr. is a short, insignificant little man with a blood-drenched reputation. Ferret-faced, with a good physique, he angrily argued his case of innocence for 2 hours during his interview as part of the research for this book, but doubts that he will ever be released from prison. So what do we understand about Ronald DeFeo? We know that he was, and still is, an illiterate and bullying thug, characteristics which he shares with many individuals who are not criminals. We know that he was addicted to heroin. Again, hardly an unusual occurrence in today's society. We know that telling lies was routine, commonplace behavior for him. He manufactured countless versions of the crimes in a manner so characteristic of serial killers and mass murderers, yet none of these qualities necessarily makes a multiple murderer. The main problem is that DeFeo cried wolf too many times, so who would believe a word he says today? He is a liar through and through. More recently, Butch argued that he did not throw the rifle into the dock. "I did not throw the .35 Marlin rifle in the water," he wrote in a letter, "nor did I realize that he, Richard, threw it there." When shown the map of the dock and the drawings made by the police, which were initialed by him, I asked Butch how the police diver managed to locate the exact location of the rifle so quickly when no one had told them where it was. He contradicted himself, saying, "I told them it was behind my house because I didn't want to be beat up anymore." When pressed about the diagrams, he changed his story again. "The Marlin rifle was found after I was in the Suffolk County Jail, so there is no way I told the police. I never knew where the gun was thrown, and that's the truth. And I never signed any diagrams. I initialed blank pieces of yellow paper only." What do we know about the trial and surrounding circus? If we know nothing else, we know that many questions, possibly of grave importance, were both unasked and unanswered. Even today, the issues raised by the blood-stained clothing and unburned powder found on Dawn's nightdress, which could so easily be resolved, remain in the realms of mystery. We know about the strange conversation between Butch's grandfather and another thug. This was recorded on tape by the police and included references, among other unsavory topics, to the murder of Butch in prison. We know that the police investigation and the resultant convictions were concluded in a very untidy manner, clearly just to get the job done. Yet none of these qualities necessarily makes a false conviction, with the exception of any startling new evidence which might appear to dispel public anxieties about the behavior of those in authority. It is clear that at least some of the police, lawyers, and one judge involved in the case acted unethically, if not illegally. To assume otherwise would blind oneself to the true nature of the American judicial system. Disturbing though this may be, it does not necessarily entail a false conviction. Nevertheless, William A. Weber seemed to do very well for himself out of the DeFeo case. Over a few bottles of wine during the evening after Butch was sentenced on the 4th of December, 1974, Weber and the new owners of High Hopes, George and Kathleen Lutz, cooked up a story that shocked the world. The house was haunted, they said, possessed by the evil spirit of a long-dead Shinnecock Indian chief and, of course, had been built on an ancient Indian burial ground. It was this story that subsequently became the movie The Amityville Horror. Once the Lutzes realized now much money was involved, they decided to cut Weber out of the deal. In turn, he filed a lawsuit in the U.S. District Court in Brooklyn, presided over by Judge Jack B. Weinstein. In his decision, the judge stated, "The canons and ethics of law prevent Mr. Weber from being involved in Mr. DeFeo's criminal case and his appeals, while at the same time being involved in movie deals, books, etc." As a result of this ruling, Weber had to settle for a small amount of money out of court, but it did not prevent him taking $20,000 from DeFeo's relatives for appeals of the conviction. Nor did it stop him from finding other ways to profit from the Amityville tragedy. He teamed up with Professor Hans Holzer, a ghost hunter from England. Together they wrote a book called Murder in Amityville, which subsequently became the motion picture Amityville II, The Possession. Was one of Butch's stories true, and if so, which account can we believe? Did he stumble upon some kind of gangland execution in progress? This is feasible to the extent that the medical examiner was convinced that at least 3 people had been involved with the subduing and shooting of the victims. But if this was the case, is it not likely that Butch would have been shot along with the rest of his family? Who else incidentally knew about the .35 caliber Marlin lever-action rifle that belonged to him? Were there conspirators who wanted a pawn, someone trained to passivity and dependence, who would take the blame for them? Why then the long silence from Butch and his friends until 20 or so years after the crimes were committed? An answer may lie in the fact that each and every one of Butch's close friends, including his estranged wife, were threatened, bullied, and even assaulted by the police at the time. Many of these police officers, including Detective Lieutenant Robert Dunn and Detective Dennis Rafferty, were still employed with the Suffolk County Police at the time this book was being researched. Perhaps these witnesses had every reason to fear reprisals from law officers who survived immense criticism only to resurface unscathed many years later. Another factor is that DeFeo came from a family with strong links to organized crime and the mafia. Is it any wonder that Richard Raimondo, for example, went into hiding and assumed a false identity? George and Kathy Lutz moved into 112 Ocean Avenue on December 18th. 28 days later, they fled in terror. So begins Chapter 1 of Jay Anson's novel, The Amityville Horror. Written as a work of non-fiction, the book purports to relate the day-to-day events that drove the new residents of High Hopes from their home in terror. The book became a runaway bestseller and was made into a popular movie starring Rod Steiger, Margot Kidder, and James Brolin. Their fantastic story, never disclosed in full detail, makes for an unforgettable book, with all the shocks and gripping suspense of The Exorcist, The Omen, or Rosemary's Baby. But with one vital difference: the story is true, reads the trailer on the book's back cover. In truth, the entire book and subsequent movies were little more than fiction. Nevertheless, the Lutz's brief stay and claims of supernatural activity at High Hopes thrust Amityville and 112 Ocean Avenue into the world's spotlight. For more than 30 years, the house has stood as an icon of terror, erasing the happier times that any family had enjoyed inside the charming Dutch colonial property. Eventually, the notoriety the Lutzes had heaped upon themselves paid them back. Pestered by sightseers and turned into pariahs in their own decent community, they were forced to move out. On the 30th of August, 1976, they returned their home to Columbia Savings and Loan instead of returning to live in it or selling it to another family in the normal way. On the 18th of March, 1977, Jim and Barbara Cromartie purchased the house for a mere $55,000, quite unaware of its infamous reputation. When they learned about its recent history, they were forced to change the address to 108 and add a fake window to the front of the building. Determined as they were to make their home part of the community again, the Cromarties were bombarded with hordes of tourists looking for ghosts and demons. Eventually, the fans proved unbearable, and they put the house on the market and moved out. The Cromarties left Frank Birch to tend to the property and act as house sitter while they were away. Neither Mr. Birch nor the Cromarties ever reported supernatural occurrences in the house. The family eventually moved back in and took the house off the market. They remained there until 1987, when David Roskin, Barbara's son from a previous marriage, passed away unexpectedly. On the 17th of August, 1987, Peter and Jean O'Neill bought 108 Ocean Avenue for an unspecified amount. They lived happily there until 1997, when they were forced to sell the place because of the high taxes associated with it, which amounted to $7,000 a year. According to friends, they chose to spend the money on their children's college education rather than give it to the tax collector. On the 10th of June, 1997, Brian Wilson purchased the house for $310,000. At the time of writing, he resides there with his wife and 2 children who attend college. Mr. Wilson says that he is very happy with the house and has no complaints. In fact, he has invested in the property by restoring the boathouse and improving the accommodation. When I visited High Hopes, I asked Brian Wilson whether perhaps he might consider at some time in the future to replacing the spooky quarter-moon windows on the 3rd floor. He smiled and said, "Maybe."